Good morning, good afternoon, everybody. I'm David Goach, and I'm General Counsel for SEMA, the association serving one of the most fun, dynamic sports and hobbies, populated by the most passionate and innovative individuals, many of whom are on this virtual call right now. I miss seeing all of you at the show this year. 2021 is going to be a great year. I've been particularly excited about today's program since it's been 46 years in the making. To briefly set the stage, answering the question, why all this attention, Section 203 of the Clean Air Act prohibits the manufacturer, selling, or installation of any device that intentionally circumvents EPA emission standards by bypassing, defeating, or rendering inoperative a required element of the motor vehicle's emission control system. Now, a motor vehicle is any self-propelled vehicle designed for transporting persons on property, on a street or highway. In light of this mandate, the issue of how do you lawfully comply is not just a consideration, it is a singular focal point for anyone in the performance parts industry. In 1974, the EPA issued an interim policy, what came to be known as Memo 1A, addressing enforcement of the tampering prohibitions of the Clean Air Act. Despite referencing reasonable basis 9 times in the memo, that's including 2 references to reasonably believes, Memo 1A was somewhat short on detail related to how do you establish that reasonable basis. And in the following nearly 5 decades, this lack of clarity led many to the conclusion that a CARB EO was the de facto solution to achieving federal compliance. Thankfully, in collaboration with industry, the EPA did supersede Memo 1A the end of last year and issued its tampering policy, and that's what we're here to talk about today. Joining me on the panel today is an outstanding group of experts. First person many of you know, Peter Tridy, the Director of Emissions Compliance at the SEMA Garage. He's here to provide technical assistance, and since the rest of us are lawyers, to be the only honest person in the room. The second panelist, Evan Belzer. Evan is the Deputy Director for the US EPA's Air Enforcement Division. This is the agency headquarter office dedicated to the civil enforcement of the Clean Air Act. In this role, Evan manages nationally significant enforcement cases and policy matters. Evan also serves as the chair of the steering committee for the EPA's National Compliance Initiative, stopping aftermarket defeat devices for vehicles and engines. And lastly, Justin Savage, yes, another lawyer. He's an environmental partner at Sidley Austin, where he leads the auto sector group and co-leads the environmental group. Justin regularly defends aftermarket companies in EPA, DOJ, and CARB cases and advises on emission risks on the buy and sell side of aftermarket deals. Real quick, some housekeeping. This is your program, folks, so we want to hear from you and answer as many of your questions as possible. We're going to be in presentation format for the beginning. We're going to have a slide deck, what have you, but feel free to send questions throughout the program using the Q&A function. That's the best way to send questions that you want answers, anything you're seeking clarity on, and we'll fit them in as appropriate during the formal comments, but we'll definitely leave plenty of time at the end for Q&A. Only use the chat function for commentary or discussion. We will be recording this. And in probably a week, roughly a week, it will be up online, accessible at sema.org/virtual education. Now to kick it off, I'll turn it over to Evan Belzer.
Thank you, Dave. Thank you, Peter. Thank you, Justin. Really glad to be here today and the chance to tell everybody what we can about our updated policy. We have a lot of common interest here, and you've got some very strong representation with Dave, Peter, and the rest of the crew at SEMA who have been sharing your perspective with me, with EPA. That made us smarter. That influenced us as we undertook this policy effort. And so very glad to be here and look forward to your questions and answer them the best that I can. Next slide. I've got about 24 total slides, and I'm hoping to finish in about 25 minutes. And in that time, what I'd like to do is to help explain what our National Compliance Initiative is, why we're so active when it comes to aftermarket defeat devices and tampering. But of course, want to focus on the tampering policy itself make sure you know what it is, what it is not. I've got a reference to what legal prohibitions underlie all this work. For your reference, Dave just read them for you. We've got a single policy statement right in the center of the tampering policy, which talks about how you can avoid enforcement by having a reasonable basis to show no adverse effect on emissions. We've got 6 types of reasonable bases in the policy. We'll walk through those and focus on one of particular value, I think, for this group who are, I think many of you in the performance space of the aftermarket industry. We have civil and criminal enforcement underway. We have compliance outreach, we have other work underway aimed at protecting air quality. That's our job. That's what we do. That's why we're doing all this work. And the problem with defeat devices and tampering is that a tampered truck or vehicle of any kind that's had its emissions controls removed is causing a lot of excess air pollution. And it's not just here and there. The fact is that we are finding it to be prevalent nationwide. This little schematic shows what we found through emissions testing of a diesel pickup truck. The NOx emissions, or oxides of nitrogen, increased 300 times when the emissions were removed. Next slide. In November, we finished a report, and it's publicly available, outlining what evidence we've found just in our investigations over the last few years concerning tampered diesel pickup trucks. This is not an estimate of the national prevalence, it's just what we found. And what we found is 550,000 diesel pickup trucks have been fully deleted. The emissions impact is severe. What we're seeing is a cause for concern, and we think that it's legitimately undercutting our efforts to improve air quality. And so, we've been regulating these for some years under the Clean Air Act, and a lot of that progress is being undone by this work in aftermarket, by bad actors who are choosing to remove controls on these vehicles. Next slide, please. Quick reminder that mobile sources add up. More than half of the air pollution, NOx pollution in the country comes from mobile sources. And NOx, or oxides of nitrogen, is a primary ingredient that leads to ozone in the atmosphere. Ozone is bad for people's health. It makes breathing difficult. It exacerbates asthma, other respiratory illness. We have active investigations we can't comment on. We also have in every region, civil and criminal, that are active in this space. And it's not just the EPA. We're working a lot with states. And we have states are not directly implementing the Clean Air Act. They're not enforcing it the way we do. That's just not how the law works in this space. However, they have their own laws, and states have been a critical partner for decades dealing with mobile sources of air pollution. They run inspection maintenance programs for smog check and have other programs in place to help achieve ambient air quality standards. A lot of states are struggling to get their ozone levels down to safe levels, and we think that tampering is undercutting their efforts. To complement the casework, this is not just about taking cases, it's about preventing violations. That's what we're here to do today. It's what we're here to do every day. And we are updating enforcement policy. That's the focus of today's conversation. Next, we also put out that report I mentioned about tampered diesel pickup trucks to help people understand better how we're seeing the extent of the problem. Next slide, please.
Evan, could I ask a question? I know the answer to this, but I think for the benefit of those on the call, you've made a lot of references to diesel. The report was about diesel trucks, and a lot of the charts were with tampering on diesel vehicles and fleets and trucks. But the EPA is also interested in and looks at gasoline engines as well, correct?
That's right. We are looking at, we do our best to deploy our resources however we think is the best way to prevent air pollution. And so that includes, not just diesel, but also gasoline, motorcycle, and non-road sectors as well. So we have a new policy, the tampering policy. This is an update to existing policy. As Dave mentioned, we had Memorandum 1A for quite a long time. And with the tampering policy, we are reaffirming the same core policy position from Memo 1A. which we're going to talk about in detail today, which is if you can show us you're not adversely affecting emissions, even if you're using the configuration, we're probably not going to take that case. We're going to move on because we've limited resources and want to focus where it matters most for air quality. So we didn't move the goalposts here. Rather, we consolidated existing enforcement policies and restated them in terms of today's technology. So it is direction for EPA personnel, how to prioritize resources, how to routinize our work, what types of information to be sure we ask for and consider at the outset and throughout our investigation. We are making it public because we think it's useful for you to have it as well. Next slide, please. Just as important as what it is to focus on what it is not. And in advance, I apologize if I keep harping on these points, but it's important. The tampering policy is not a regulation. This is not a rule. That it does not create any obligation on regulated parties. It does not require you to have a reasonable basis. Rather, what it says is if you have a reasonable basis to show no adverse effect on emissions, EPA considers that and typically doesn't take an enforcement case. The tampering policy is not a parts certification program. Consistent with our longstanding practice, we do not pre-approve parts under the tampering policy. We are also in this document not saying what is or is not legal. This is not dividing the world between what's legal and not. This is not an interpretive document. And importantly, it's not a guide to every possible situation. There are endless situations out there, especially when you consider all the different types of technology OEMs employ, all the innovative things that are happening in the aftermarket, and all the different types of situations you're going to see across sectors. But we are not attempting to answer every possible question out there. I know that that may be frustration, a point of frustration for some of you, but as a matter of enforcement policy, we come in at a higher level and reserve right to act, on the facts on a case-by-case basis. Next slide. I'm not going to read through these, but I want to remind everybody that we have in the Clean Air Act a prohibition on defeat devices. Next slide. And on tampering. These are quite strict, and they are our playbook. As an enforcement office, our job at bottom is to go find facts, find out what's happening, see whether the parts being sold or installed amount to a violation of these laws. And by and large, there are not regulations. And so the question tends to be simply, does the conduct amount to a violation of those provisions? This slide here is to note that there is in section 113 of the Clean Air Act, which lists those things that are crimes. It identifies it as a crime to knowingly falsify, tamper with, render inaccurate, or fail to install any monitoring device or method required under the Clean Air Act. And vehicle onboard diagnostic systems are a monitoring device or method required by the Clean Air Act, and that has been part of the basis for resolved EPA criminal enforcement cases. Again, I'm from the Civil Enforcement Office, and so I won't be saying more about criminal enforcement. Next slide reminds everybody that while states are not implementing, the mobile source provisions of the Clean Air Act, like in other areas, including stationary sources of air pollution, states have a role to play, and they have their own laws on the books. There's more law there than you might think about prohibitions on tampering. Sometimes they prohibit dealers from selling tampered vehicles, regardless of who tampered them. And of course, many have violations, identified a violation to operate a tampered vehicle. And that's the legal basis for a lot of their inspection and maintenance programs that require you show your vehicle meets standard before you get it re-registered. Okay, next slide. So this is the policy statement that's right at the center of the tampering policy. This is the most important part. And so I'm going to read it. The EPA typically does not take enforcement for conduct that might be a violation of the prohibition on tampering and defeat devices if the person has a documented reasonable basis to conclude that they're not adversely affecting emissions. And of course, in the event we're investigating somebody for making and selling parts, the question is whether once installed, it has a reasonable basis to show it's not affecting emissions. The policy statement does not, however, apply to conduct affecting an onboard diagnostic system, which may be subject to enforcement regardless of effect on emissions. So this is the centerpiece of the tampering policy. And the term reasonable basis is highlighted there because that is what we're going to look at next. And that is the type, that is what you want to have ready if we come asking about your compliance with the Clean Air Act. Next slide. We have a non-exclusive list of reasonable bases in the policy. Again, we're not trying to identify and answer questions for every possible situation, but we do see a lot of similar questions that come up and a lot of similar sort of categories of conduct out there that we investigate. And so we have identified 6. Reasonable basis A is that there's a reasonable basis where the part's identical and is being used to replace or maintain something on the vehicle or engine. Reasonable basis B is specific to replacement after treatment systems like filters and catalysts. And technically speaking, those are different than a lot of other types of aftermarket parts. And so we identified a reasonable basis specific to those. Footnote that we have an ongoing effort to revisit a policy from 1986, which is specifically about replacement catalytic converters for older gasoline light duty cars. We just had comment period close on that, and this year we're focused on deciding whether to update that, and if so, how. Reasonable basis C is much less often used, but it comes up sometimes. Sometimes people add new after treatment systems to decrease emissions, and so we have a statement there about where we'd identify there to be a reasonable basis. Now, reasonable basis D is important, and we're going to focus on it a lot today. It's something of a catch-all, and I think maybe most useful for those in the performance aftermarket sector. And it's emissions testing that demonstrates no adverse effect on emissions. We're going to spend more time on that. Reasonable basis E is that there's an aftermarket part that's been certified or approved by EPA. Now, a minute ago, I just said EPA doesn't approve parts under the tampering policy. That is true. As some of you know, however, in the Clean Air Act itself, Congress required EPA to write regulations that would, as a voluntary matter, allow aftermarket companies who manufacture replacement emissions components to get a certificate from EPA, from EPA's Office of Transportation Air Quality, not from the Enforcement Office. And the reason for that is so that the vehicle owner can choose to buy their replacement emission control system from that company and be sure that they're not voiding the emissions warranty. It's not an active program. People aren't applying for certification, but for the sake of completeness, we included it in the tampering policy. And lastly, as has been the case for decades, reasonable basis F, if your part is covered by an executive order from CARB, you've got a reasonable basis. Next slide, please. Again, this is an illustrative but not exclusive list. There's all kinds of different scenarios out there. And again, this is not that the policy says you have to have it, but this is meant to illustrate the type of information that would convince us to move on. Of course, we need that documentation when we ask for it. And so it's not to say we wouldn't consider it if it came around sometime further down the road in our investigation. But when we exercise discretion, that is when we decide to move on and look no further, is usually at the beginning or somewhere in the middle of the beginning of the investigation. And so it's far more useful for you to have that ready before we arrive. And if we're looking at a specific vehicle, we compare the modified vehicle to the original stock configuration, not to how it happened to be before it was modified, right? So that's important. That's the delta that we watch. Next slide. So reasonable basis D is going to be the primary focus for the rest of my slides. Emissions testing demonstrates no adverse effect on emissions. So paraphrasing, we will typically find there's a reasonable basis where the conduct alters a vehicle, and emissions testing of an appropriate test vehicle modified in the same way shows that it complies with all applicable emission standards for its full useful life. And where the conduct in question is the marketing or sale, distribution of the parts, something on the supply side, that the part or component is marketed as suitable only to those vehicles that are appropriately represented by that test that you performed. Next slide. Few key notes I want to highlight. These are in the tampering policy. I want to make sure you see them here. First, the emissions testing may be performed by a third party. You don't have to do it yourself. A third party such as SEMA Garage. It's quite an endeavor to open an emissions test lab. You not only do you need expensive and complicated equipment, you need experts to run it, maintain it, and learn from doing and get better at it. Time and again, in the course of our investigations, we're at a point where engineers in my office or one of the regional offices are looking at information we've obtained about parts that have been sold. And what we're doing, as you could expect, is deciding what to act on. We're deciding where to spend our time, deciding where to respond with an enforcement action or respond with a warning or just move on. And so it's not always all or nothing with the company. It's down to the specific parts. And where somebody has testing from SEMA Garage or another reputable lab, right away, it's less of a priority. Doesn't mean we won't ask more questions to be sure we understand what data you have, what reasonable basis you have. But that is less a priority as compared to the next part or the next case where there's simply no testing at all. Second note here, have the documentation at or before the conduct, right? That gives you the most cover and the most assurance that if we're asking about your compliance, you have a good answer. It's not required, of course, but some companies, and I think it's a good idea, are choosing to make their reasonable basis testing information publicly available, whether it's on their website or in the product literature. I think there's two main benefits. One, EPA sees that too. And as we decide where to target and where to investigate, we're going to be less likely to investigate a specific company or part if they are proactively showing that they have a reasonable basis. It doesn't mean that we won't ask questions, but we are always in the mode of triage and, like I said, working the best we can for air quality. I also think that it may behoove the company because vendors are going to continue to get scrutiny from distributors. They want to know, distributors have skin in the game. They want to know whether what the vendor is providing them is a compliant product. And it may be simpler to just to be fully transparent with what information you have for your compliance. Third note, the emissions testing and documentation are generally the same as what's required for new vehicle certification. Again, we're not imposing obligations to the tampering policy, but we have decades of experience at the EPA with new vehicle certification, what type of judgment needs to be made throughout, and what type of documentation is appropriate balance to show to demonstrate that there's compliance, and be reasonable under all the circumstances. So while those regs do not squarely apply to aftermarket, they're a wonderful source of information for what type of information the EPA finds to be useful in assessing compliance. And last, the EPA expects that the vehicle or engine, whatever it is, acts the same on the test as off the test. We've had a lot of recent enforcement cases, including Volkswagen, Fiat Chrysler automobiles, Daimler Mercedes-Benz, where companies were calibrating their engines to operate differently off cycle. That test does not show compliance for that vehicle if the test is being cheated. And so we take it seriously when it comes to OEMs. We take it seriously when it comes to aftermarket as well. Be sure that your software works the same on and off the test. Next slide, please. I've got 5 more slides, and these are to begin to answer the questions that SEMA shared in advance, and I know are important to many of you. And so the first here is durability. What I'm going to do in these slides is focus you on language from the tampering policy so you know which part to look to. But I have to put down the caveat that we were quite intentional in how we wrote this document. It was signed by top leadership at the agency, and we declined to go into more detail in the policy for our own reasons. And so I'm able to clarify today. I'm able to point you to the right parts of the policy, but I'm not able to expand on the tampering policy. So when it comes to durability, tampering policy has some language directly on point. It says that one may employ OEM deterioration factors as specified in the pertinent application for EPA certification if doing so is consistent with good engineering judgment. This generally aligns with CARB's requirements in most situations. In new vehicle certification, EPA is very strict with OEMs about durability because it's not much help if the vehicle is clean just for a little while. Emission systems do wear down over time. We know that, but that can be quantified and is expressed as what are called deterioration factors or DFs. In many situations, we'll agree there's a reasonable basis where you rely on the OEM's deterioration factors. But if you are modifying something about the original configuration that is likely to wear down the emissions controls more, or likely to compromise the durability of the emission control system as a whole, then we may scrutinize your decision to rely on deterioration factors. Next slide, please. Evaporative emissions. So we talked a lot about exhaust emission standards, understandably, but throughout the tampering policy, where we're talking about emission standards, talking about elements of design, and other requirements, it's speaking just as much to evaporative emissions control requirements as to exhaust control requirements. And so, do you need to do full shed testing? In many cases, we have agreed there's a reasonable basis without full evaporative shed testing. Often, a reliable strategy is to use components that have been certified to meet evaporative standards. That's what a lot of OEMs do. And so if you're changing something about the fueling system, hoses, tanks, other things that may affect evaporative controls, we're concerned about that because that could mean more hydrocarbons coming out, and that's harmful air pollution as well. But if you're using individual components that have been proven to control those emissions, then generally we would agree there's a reasonable basis even without shed testing. Next slide. Test vehicle selection. Tampering policy has language on this, which is that to select test vehicles or test engines where EPA regulations do not otherwise prescribe how to do so for purposes of original certification, one should choose the worst case from among all the products for which the part or component is intended. The appropriate source for worst case technical information is the product's OEM. And by information, we mean publicly available, of course. This aligns with CARB requirements in most situations. We expect it will. When we talk here about being prescribed for grouping under the regulations, EPA has regulations for OEMs for new certification that explains how to group vehicles. They're often called test groups for light duty or engine families for other sectors. And that reflects a group that are sufficiently similar that one test will represent all of them. Where you're doing your reasonable basis testing under reasonable basis D and you're extrapolating beyond that test group that the OEM chose for new vehicle certification, there needs to be a clear technical justification to convince us why that's appropriate. It may be, but but given the judgment already made by the agency and the OEM in making that originally and testing it originally, there needs to be clear justification. Next slide. SEMA asked about test cycles. And what the tampering policy says about that is that the emissions testing and documentation are generally the same as required under 1065 for new certification. And typically the test cycles are listed there, 5 or 6 cycles. Of course, again, bears repeating, we need your product to work the same on and off the test. And per reasonable basis F, a CARB EO is a reasonable basis, right? And so even if CARB does not require certain test cycles, that's adequate for us. Next slide. Onboard diagnostics. Again, the policy statement in the tampering policy does not apply to conduct affecting an OBD system, which may be subject to enforcement, regardless of effect on emissions. So in other words, we are not with the tampering policy committing to forego enforcement under certain circumstances when it comes to OBD modifications. OBD is very important to EPA, to CARB, to states who are trying to run inspection maintenance programs. And they are how the vehicle can identify whether its emissions control system is in spec and working properly. Now, if CARB allows changes to OBD for to get an executive order, then again, that's fine. We would that's a reasonable basis as well, even if CARB allows for some changes. Next slide. I think that's the last one. We get a lot of information from the public at large about suspected violations. People are very concerned. And so we encourage people to provide that information, and we made it easy. You can send it to tampering@epa.gov, and that will help us to identify where to focus our work. So I will pass it off to Justin Savage and look forward to talking about it more after his presentation.
Thanks, Evan. I'm going to offer a perspective as someone who acts as a defense counsel in civil cases, criminal cases, and also does some deal work in this space and provides counsel to companies looking to buy or sell aftermarket companies. So that's my perspective. Sometimes folks ask, do you work with EPA? No, I'm private. Just clarify up front. Let's go to the next slide, please. So Evan's talked to you at length about the tampering policy. Here's my perspective as a defense lawyer, and this is based on what we know today. The tampering policy is relatively new. I think, as you heard from Evan, there is a reasonable basis for many parts in the aftermarket. I think we've been able to advise companies on how to navigate this. So there is a path forward. I think that is good. But I think you also need, as a company or individuals, to understand the context and the scope. And the context here is that the policy, as Evan said, is general in nature. So you really need to understand what is happening in specific cases. Most folks know that the vast majority of aftermarket companies are small businesses. It is a challenge, even as a lawyer, to keep up with all the cases that EPA brings. As an example of this context, there were 31 cases in fiscal year 2020. So I think from a compliance perspective, it's helpful for Evan to talk about the policy. I do think outreach from the agency, because each of these cases dealt with specific hard parts or tuners or other features that folks need to understand. I understand this because I've been working on this a substantial part of my time, a lot of years, but it's something, the two key ones are race parts. So these would be parts used on a vehicle converted full-time to racing, and onboard diagnostic, or OBD. Let's go to the next slide, please. So race parts. From a legal perspective, tampering and OBD monitoring tampering apply to quote unquote motor vehicles under the Clean Air Act. And so the legal question is it a motor vehicle if it's originally born a certified vehicle for the public roads, but it's been converted to a race vehicle by removing certain parts and it's used on a track? So in the tampering policy, the quote is right here. It says it doesn't address vehicles used solely for competition motorsports or parts sold for there. I have had several people in the aftermarket, even some lawyers, say, well, this means that race parts are completely lawful and therefore of no concern. That is not EPA's position. I think you'll see EPA's position in the next bullet here, which is they're not going to go after racers if you can demonstrate that it's used solely for competition motorsports. But where the enforcement or compliance issue arises is against, on this issue, principally against manufacturers, suppliers, distributors of tuners and hard parts. How do you make that showing that this is in fact a race part? And there's been lots of litigation with EPA that is settled on this issue, meaning there's been resolutions And the agency has not yet had a court decision. The first court decision we anticipate is cited in the last bullet here, United States versus Gearbox Z. SEMA filed an amicus brief on some of the racing issues. Dave did a nice job on that. So if you'd like that, please ask Dave or myself. And so just to sum up on race parts, if you have race parts, you can always try to go through the reasonable basis process of the tampering policy that Evan articulated well. But the issue is, does the law require, that if these vehicles are used solely on a track? And in some instances, if you're doing things for safety, like disabling the EGR or taking out other features, you may not be able to show a reasonable basis. So I think overall, as I said, there is a reasonable compliance path under the tampering policy. But if you've got motor competition, sports parts, or race parts, there may be some features where you have to try to do a reasonable basis in the tampering policy, but it may not be possible because there are some features disabled. So that's really the dispute. I think most companies are able to navigate that, but I think there are some parts and some companies that will, that have some issues in terms of how do they show compliance. Let's go to the next slide, please. The issue here with onboard diagnostics is complicated. Until Volkswagen, I do not believe that EPA was significantly looking at criminal charges for affecting the OBD system. But you'll see in the first bullet point here that it's the policy does not address OBD. And in the second bullet point here, and as Evan said, EPA is charging people with felony tampering with a monitoring device for disabling OBD. So the race parts issue, we primarily see that hitting manufacturers and suppliers, and people take different approaches. I think there is a path forward there for most companies and suppliers. But on this one, we see this most often, the OBD issue hitting installers or shops or fleets where people take the OBD system and disable it. As I mentioned at the top, this is a novel interpretation of the Clean Air Act. That does not necessarily mean that EPA would lose in court, but it's just something to consider. And there's a citation and the hyperlink in the materials. You can read some background on it. As far as I know, there's been one case where this issue has been litigated, United States versus Diamond Environmental Services in San Diego in the Southern District of California. If you go to the next slide, please. And there, the government indicted, I believe, an individual. Ultimately, the indictment was voluntarily dismissed by the U.S. You don't have to read the material here, but just to tell you what happened, they indicted, I believe, a fleet owner or a fleet mechanic for removing OBD. But it turned out that the OBD requirements for which this individual was indicted or this company were not in effect and approved at the time of the alleged conduct, or at the time of the model year vehicle, which was the allegedly tampered with. Why do I bring this up? Just to say that I think it's true for both race parts and OBD that there's some legal uncertainty there. And in the case of OBD, that uncertainty is just heightened because of the fact that it is a state program primarily. EPA doesn't have an OBD program. They don't really approve OBD. It's done primarily by the OEMs through CARB and then in turn approved by EPA. So this just adds another wrinkle when you're dealing with OBD to consider. So next slide, and this is the final one. What are your key takeaways? At least from my perspective, the tampering policy, I think, is a large step forward. Memo 1A was from 1974, an interim draft. The tampering policy, I think, provides reasonable certainty and a compliance path for, I think, many covered issues. But that requires a challenge for the aftermarket. There are many small businesses. A lot of people don't have in-house lawyers or compliance officers. And it does take keeping up with just the dozens of new cases EPA brings every year and familiarizing themselves, such as the 31 cases brought last year. And then outside of the policy scope, it just means keeping an eye on those two key issues we talked about, race parts and OBD, and understanding the agency's viewpoint, the risks there, and then how to manage them, which is something many companies can do, but I also know it's a concern for many companies. Thank you.
Well, as we now turn into the Q&A, this is going to be the part that I always thought would be most interesting. And first off, I do want to thank the participants. It's difficult to, for anyone to come into an audience where the folks might be adverse to their position, but the fact of the matter is the Clean Air Act is the law of the land, so the obligation of the EPA is to enforce it. That being said, and I thank Evan honestly for his efforts and the work on the policy, and as Justin just stated, it's a very good step in the right direction. That being said, though, it's my obligation on behalf of the industry to try to press for more clarity. And we're getting a lot of questions, but I'm going to try to tee it up with sort of some softball questions, because at the end of the day, my belief, not just my assumption, my genuine belief is, we have 363 participants on this call. They're on this call because they want to comply. Their goal is to design and produce parts that they can lawfully sell. And obviously, again, it's not that it's an opposite point of view, but with the EPA's goal being ensuring a clean environment, how can we further this discussion to be able to give them comfort about this? Just to ask a quick question. So you referred to, a CARB, a change to OBD that CARB recognizes, then all this, that's acceptable to EPA. Is it accurate to say that that is not the only type of OBD alteration that would ever be viewed as acceptable to EPA? Only one that CARB has recognized as a result of their procedure?
I thought you said it was going to be a softball, Dave. So what I said was that if you have a CARB executive order for a part, and that part modifies OBD, then the tampering policy directs EPA personnel to move on. That's not a case we're going to take. That part's been proven to the satisfaction of my friends and colleagues at ARB that it controls air pollution, and so we move on. But we are intentional in this policy about not drawing a line between what's legal and what's not legal. And so I can't give any real comfort on OBD modifications.
Well, and to that point, because I like what you just said about moving on, because earlier in your slides, you made the reference to third-party testing like the SEMA garage, and thank you for acknowledging all the work that SEMA has done for the industry and the garage. But sort of the hypothetical you gave was that if the EPA shows up at a manufacturer and they produce testing, you said at that point it's not a priority.
Right.
And to me, that still it begs the question, but it still might be an issue. And is that the correct phraseology, or is it what you just said? We have testing, it's reasonable basis, and you move on, i.e., that matter is closed. I am thinking, if I'm a manufacturer on this call, I want the certainty if I'm going to go through. Compliance is expensive. It's time consuming. It costs money for testing. It costs money for continued R&D. I think instead of saying it's not a priority, I think to the extent that there is third-party testing by a credible test house, SEMA garage, that the EPA acknowledges that it's no longer sort of this less important, potentially still open issue, i.e. not a priority, but that in fact, per this tampering policy, it's a resolved issue. And I was wondering if I could get you to sort of maybe clarify that statement. I think that's really important to these folks. If they're going to undertake the time and the money to get the testing, to then show that testing, here's our testing, folks. We got it, EPA. EPA says, thank you. It all looks in order. Case closed.
I don't mind the pressure on this point, and I get it. There's a lot of uncertainty in the absence of a part certification program. And what we have here is a 10-page policy that says how we're going to prioritize. And so that's why I used my word choice earlier. From where I sit, I can't think of a time that when we're looking at the information we obtain in an investigation, and it comes to part ABC 1, 2, 3, that I can't think of a time where we have come across emissions testing from SEMA Garage or another reputable lab and alleged violations on that part. We might have asked more questions about, well, what was the test vehicle? What parts what vehicles are you selling it for? But we move on when there is emissions testing showing no adverse effect on emissions.
And then I want to turn this over to Peter, because we've been getting a lot of questions. These are just sort of mine based on the presentation, and other panelists, please chime in. But I think, Evan, that's the most important point to make so far, that and again, I'm paraphrasing, so correct this statement. To date, the EPA has not taken enforcement action against a part when, if visited, a manufacturer has been able to produce, and I'm going to say it, SEMA Garage testing.
Whether SEMA Garage or another reputable lab, that's what Memo 1A said, and that's what we restated in the tampering policy, but in terms of today's technology, right? That's it, right? And Justin's right that a lot of this makes more sense the closer you are to it, and that's why we make all of our resolved cases available in one place, and you can see where we're focusing our effort. And our efforts have overwhelmingly been on delete pipes, delete tuners, right? That's been our focus. We think that there's a lot of open questions about some parts that are not characterized as delete tuners, delete pipes. We think that there's increased emissions. We've done testing showing a tuner triples NOx emissions, even when the after treatment remains in place. So believe me, we're concerned about more than just deletes, but that's been our focus. And so when that's our focus and we come across the next part, and the next part has emissions testing showing it's under standard, then that's what I meant by it's not a priority. It means we move on, and we have discretion to choose which claims to focus on. And we don't focus on those that have emissions testing.
Yeah, and I think, and I lied because I was going to say one more comment, but then I'll promise Peter or Justin, you can chime in. But I believe that the EPA would be doing the industry a service if it somehow acknowledged the fact that parts actually do get looked at, but when testing exists, and I mean not in this policy sense of broad sweeping terminology, but in an enforcement action, it would be great that if you're enforcing against part XYZ 1, 2, 3, the EPA would say, yeah, we also looked at part ABC 4, 5, 6, and it had testing, and we did not enforce. I think that type of messaging to the industry would be useful, because to your point, yeah, it's great that the EPA, makes hay out of all the cases it's closed and the actions that exist, but really the messaging there is an ominous one. We're coming after you, as opposed to saying, no, we enforce against those who are in violation of the law, but there are parts out there that we have, just because we show up doesn't necessarily mean that we're gonna put you through the ringer.
This is Justin. I'll just add, Evan and I have had this discussion, and when I talked about the policy, the context, there is just dozens of cases a year. And I think in some areas of enforcement, like the fuels market, EPA is much more transparent. I think this is a more challenging environment. But to your point, Dave, how do companies know about what I'll call the silent evidence? The catback that was looked at in a case, but then EPA said, we're not going to proceed. I think it's a challenge. I mean, we're a big law firm. We internally monitor this. I've got a handle on it. But one of the things I love about the aftermarket is you've got these American dream companies, small businesses. They've grown up. They are a vibrant part of their community. They don't have the resources of General Motors to track all this stuff on a day-to-day basis. So I do think, and Evan and I have had this discussion, there is room for improvement on transparency on the decisions, including the decisions not to go forward on a particular part.
I hear you. I'll take that back.
And with that, I'm going to ask Peter. Peter's been monitoring the Q&A, and it's been filling up. There's a good list here. Peter, why don't you do a couple questions for Evan as you
certainly. And I just want to point out, throughout this seminar, we've had some choppiness on the audio, so I'm going to leave my video off. That seems like it might help a little bit in that regard. All right, Evan, I'm gonna try to. We've had a lot of questions, and I'm certain we are not going to get to all of these. So what I want to try to do is ask the questions that I think Evan can address most readily, since we have him here, and this is an opportune time to do that. I think some of these questions can probably be answered by myself and Dave Goach even later on. So we'll try to put our emails into the chat so that you guys have access to us. If you have specific legal questions, my guess is that between Dave and Justin, you can get answers to those because they have experience dealing with the specific legal things. Evan, many of the questions that we're getting are related to how EPA will handle racing use products. So if you could elaborate a bit on everything that you've talked about here, as far as I can tell, is related to the legal treatment of products that would be used on the street. What is EPA's stance on racing use products?
Thanks, Peter. So there's been recent statements. We did not address this question in the tampering policy because I think it's a separate conversation from the subject of the tampering policy. But just last September, for example, Justin quoted one of these letters. Our leadership here wrote a couple letters that addressed this head on. And in very short, what that said was that the EPA's position is that the law is not ambiguous. The law prohibits tampering with and selling and making defeat devices for EPA certified motor vehicles. And there's not an exception for when that tampering and defeat devices are to convert a vehicle for racing or for export or for anything else based on its use. The law just isn't there. But we acknowledge the rich history of amateur racing. We have never taken a case against a vehicle owner for converting their car. We routinely exercise discretion once we have information that shows that the conduct in question is actually providing parts for competition motorsports. At the same time, what those letters said, and what I've been saying for years, is that many companies hide behind claims of competition. That report about 550,000 diesel pickup trucks completely deleted, and almost every one of those parts, if not every one, was sold, quote, for competition use only. So that is a problem. People be hiding behind legitimate competition to sell defeat devices and make a buck. And so it's been important to insist and clarify that the law is not ambiguous on this point. We may have a court in Arizona deciding that relatively soon, but that once we get close to a case and see that in fact the parts are supplying racing, then we're not going to enforce, even if it amounts legally to a violation of law.
Okay, thank you. So by way of summary, it sounds to me like EPA is not looking to take enforcement cases against products that are legitimately sold for racing use. So I want to give a couple of specific examples and get your take on these. And these are a little more specific to some of the business practices that are going on out there. So in this example, if a company is selling ECU calibrations by way of email and the intent for those products is specifically for racing use or non-highway use, what are the good faith steps that an online business can implement to decrease their liability from clients falsely claiming to be race only? Is there any particular steps that can be taken? And this could range, I've seen different examples suggested, but ranging from disclaimers on the website, getting the purchaser to agree to or to accept liability or to acknowledge that the product is not to be used on the street. Those kinds of steps have been proposed. What is EPA's take in an enforcement situation regarding those steps?
Thanks, Peter. So there's not any set punch list that you can complete and then be sure that you're in the clear. What do I mean by that? I mean that we have found that disclaimers and a requirement that the buyer check a box acknowledging race only are not adequate controls to keep defeat devices off vehicles used on public roads. In many cases, they don't appear to have any effect at all, frankly. What we've said before, I can say again, which is that knowing your buyer, whether it's by vehicle identification number or because they're a race team or because you've got other indicia and information about the specific vehicle, that's the most useful when we come asking. If it's indiscriminate sales to the public, we have little reason to believe that those sales are controlled to supply only the competition community.
Let me ask a follow-up to that, because I think this will be helpful for the folks listening. Just to continue with the hypothetical. So if, for example, a manufacturer or someone selling online and they're selling tens of thousands of these to maybe one small distributor in wherever, Oshkosh, maybe the EPA is going to look at that and say that's funny, and for lack of a better phrase, you should have known better. But for the benefit of those on this call, what you're saying then is this is not a strict liability statute. So even if you are selling race parts, and this is what I just took from what you said, you're selling race parts and you sold 50 of them, and for whatever reason, even if it goes to a race team and someone happens to then take it and put it on their vehicle and drive it around the street, that's not something the EPA would enforce against.
I can't adopt that, Dave. The stakes are too high here, right? So, if somebody deletes controls from 50 pickup trucks, each one of those has 300 times the NOx impact that it should if it's being driven on the road.
That wasn't hypothetical. I know. Hypotheticals, and again, this is because when you say know your customer, then that's a standard, and I'm extrapolating out on that. They know their customer. The manufacturer sold to a race team, and the race team just so happened to be owned by someone, and their kid took that part and put it on their Mustang and drove it around the neighborhood.
Well, I haven't seen that scenario before. Is it possible? Sure, that's possible. If somebody's selling exclusively to a race team and those parts make sense for that race team, meaning they're the type of parts you need to meet, to modify a vehicle to meet the sanction rules for whatever race they're in, then it starts to add up. Then it starts to look like this is legitimate supply for racing. But if it's a part that's has all of the markings of something that's optimized for use on the road, that's suspicious. Then that does not give us any reason to believe that in fact they're being controlled to race only.
But you're still, well, I mean, you're being as helpful as you can. I appreciate that, but you are still making the point that it's facts and circumstances. and those matter both ways,
Yes.
both in
Yes.
terms of someone's defense and in the EPA's prosecution.
Well, that's right. And my comments here are about the exercise of enforcement discretion, because that's what it is when it comes to parts that delete emissions controls, purportedly for racing. You mentioned there's a knowledge element. But the knowledge element isn't knowledge about how the vehicle's used. The knowledge element is knowledge that the part is designed to defeat emissions controls. And generally speaking, that's readily, we have all the evidence we need from that just in the product description. This part defeats the DPF on your truck. This part deletes the rear O2 sensor. Well, there you go. Now we know that the manufacturer knows that that part is to defeat emissions controls.
Well,
Many out there would insist that the knowledge element has to do with the use of the vehicle, but Congress was very clear. We don't have to prove where these parts end up.
Well, but then it's not knowledge, it's whether or not it intentionally circumvents EPA emission standards. And intent is different in my mind, but we won't get into legalese about that.
Sure.
Peter, if you don't have one teed up, we got a couple questions and I want Evan, to the best of his ability, to sort of provide some guidance, because we got a couple about the difference in the enforcement discretion as to when EPA will, or when there will be a referral for criminal prosecution as opposed to just the civil, because it seems like there's been an uptick in criminal prosecution. And so what are the considerations at EPA's end in deciding whether to open up a criminal investigation?
Sure, I appreciate the question. Yeah, I'll say a bit, but I'm not going to say much because I really am here from the Civil Enforcement Office and I can't speak for my colleagues down the hall, so to speak. But generally speaking, EPA directs criminal resources to cases with the greatest environmental impact and where the defendant has demonstrated the greatest culpability. So factors can include attempts to conceal violations by lying to or attempting to mislead regulators, past history of violations, and tampering with monitoring devices we've already talked about, which goes to the underlying importance of the program in controlling emissions. A few of the cases we've resolved in the criminal enforcement sector are, included conspiracy and false statements to the EPA.
All right, I'd like to do a quick follow-up question to the previous one that I asked. We are getting a few questions about what is a business's responsibility when they cross paths with a vehicle that has already been modified or tampered with. Let's use the term tampering. So let's say a business has a vehicle that comes in and it's had some kind of defeat device done to it. And the vehicle is there for them to install a legal product, something that has a demonstration of emissions compliance. Is there any obligation on that business to take any corrective measures or to avoid doing work on that vehicle?
That's a great question. And it's important because that happens every day in this country. People are asked to do service on a vehicle that's already been tampered and they don't want to get in any trouble. So the prohibition is not simply working on a tampered vehicle, it's actually doing the tampering yourself. And so if somebody comes in and their emissions controls are tampered, but they want new tires, you can give them new tires. Right? That's an unrelated system. If the system you're asked to work on, however, has been tampered, the safest course of action is either to advise the vehicle owner, I need to return this entire system to the certified configuration, or to another, or to another configuration that's been tested and has a reasonable basis, or to decline to do the work.
Okay, I'd like to take this another direction. There's a number of questions related to this, and in the tampering policy, Evan, I think the terminology that's used regarding third-party testing is that you may use third-party testing, or third-party testing may be considered acceptable. The question is third-party testing required? So if I'm a business and I have equipment that's capable of doing measurement, emissions measurement, can I do my own testing in-house? And I acknowledge that there are varying degrees of capability here. What would be your response to this?
Sure. We make sure to identify that you can use a third-party lab, third-party services, just to be sure people know that they don't have to get this capability in-house, right? Overwhelmingly, people that I see making the effort to do it right employ professional outside services. But no, you can do it in-house if you'd like. But before you go down that path, I'd recommend consulting with experts in that area, understanding the time and cost required, and study those aspects of the tampering policy where we reference, the Part 1065 regulations, which govern new vehicle certification, the types of testing that's needed, the types of documentation. There's quite a lot of overhead associated with having a lab capable of generating the emissions testing that constitutes a reasonable basis under the tampering policy.
A related question, someone asked this, and I think this is important because, Evan, as long as I've known you, you've made the point that the EPA doesn't want to have a CARB type program. You don't want to get into testing. You don't want to be, the absolute striker ball. So can you elaborate on how good engineering judgment is, in my opinion, good engineering judgment is the foundation of reasonable basis, and correct me if you don't agree. But my point is that as someone is seeking reasonable basis, and this is to the former question, whether it's on your own testing, if you have that ability, or with the SEMA garage, that good engineering judgment means that a reasonable engineer applying their reasonable/good judgment, that's acceptable, i.e. that is a basis, that is reasonable basis.
Well, yeah, I mean, we reference good engineering judgment throughout. There's not one reasonable basis that says you simply use good engineering judgment, but it comes up because a lot of judgment needs to be exercised in the course of all the steps needed to show no adverse effect on emissions. And Dave, just the way you said it is right. It's a reasonable engineer. To me, I think it's helpful to sort of work backwards from a time where we might be challenging whether you had good engineering judgment, and think about how that would go, and know that we would bring in our own engineers who may reach a different conclusion. That could help you, to scrutinize yourself, make sure that you're thinking it through, and not reaching the conclusion you want to. Because good engineering, engineers are talented, disciplined people who don't always reach the same conclusion, but I think that, but I do think that there's room for that under the tampering policy.
And Dave, let me add something. There's actually a regulatory definition people should look at. It's in 40 CFR 1068:30. It says good engineering judgment means using generally accepted scientific and engineering principles and all relevant available data. And I have a different point of view, somewhat from Evan, in that this was intended to give engineers some discretion. And if you look at the history, it says you can basically use general practices as long as you are not deliberately overlooking relevant information or manipulating the data. So from my perspective, there's a regulation, and I think there's a history there that says, as long as you're being reasonable and not manipulating or cherry picking, should be able to proceed. Evan, in an enforcement context, may have a different view, but that is what the regulation and the Code of Federal Regulations says in its history.
All right, I want to address another category issue here. In my experience, and I deal with a lot of manufacturers of aftermarket products in my role here at SEMA, and we work with those manufacturers to get to a state of emissions compliance with those products. However, and that would include companies that make tuning devices, okay? Devices that can go in and alter the calibration on the vehicle. However, there are many businesses, and I think there's probably a number of people on this call today who have built their business around custom tuning. And that is, they might use certain products that are out there that allow them to custom tune, to allow a vehicle to run better after it's had various modifications done to it. And in some cases, it may be just the tuning by itself, custom tuning alone. But the question, Evan, is what guidance do you have for companies, businesses that are doing custom tuning? Is there a path towards compliance for a shop that is handling tuning on an individual vehicle level?
Thanks, Peter. You know, the tampering policy, when it talks about manufacturing, that includes writing tunes, right? And so the answer for a custom tuner is the same for anybody else who's writing tunes, which is that, you know, we're going to exercise discretion and move on if you can show that that tune does not adversely affect emissions.
So I think this harkens back to the answer that we just addressed, or the question that was just addressed on, you know, being able to do some level of engineering analysis, whether that be you know, a desktop analysis or an actual, you know, test verification. It would behoove a custom tuner to have data under his belt should the EPA come looking. Is that correct?
That's right. And, you know, the more it looks like the type of reasonable bases that we identify in reasonable basis D, the better. You know, but yeah, we talk about good engineering judgment and what that means. Justin's right to cite the reg. That term, good engineering judgment, comes up. But again, there's not a reasonable basis in the tampering policy that says use good engineering judgment and that'll suffice.
Great. I'd like to ask a question. This is a little more specific to enforcement techniques for EPA, but is there any kind of age limit for liability? So if a company had stopped selling compliant parts in 2017, would they still be liable for parts sold in prior years despite showing good faith of phasing out non-compliant parts? And I know that in, you know, many of the enforcement cases that we're aware of, you know, the EPA will typically look back a few years. Do you have a particular guideline on that?
Yeah, good question. We have in the law 5-year statute of limitations, which means that we can take an enforcement action for a violation that occurred as much as 5 years ago. The violation, again, is the manufacturer, the sale, the installation. And so, you know, that's a hard limit. Many of our investigations are for the past year or two. And so that's common. We reserve the right to look further, but that's fairly common. And we very much consider companies' efforts to comply, you know, especially if by the time we find out about past violations, the company's already in compliance. That's important for us, you know, because again, our efforts are aimed at preventing future violations. And part of that is taking penalty actions for past violations, but a lot of it is working on companies who aren't stopping otherwise.
Let me ask a related question because the Clean Air Act is different than California law. California law is explicit. You cannot sell without the EO. You cannot sell, market, advertise, you know, drive. So that's statutory there. Something you said earlier about if EPA shows up and you have the test results, that's the best scenario. But you sort of alluded to the fact that if you get them later, and I want to ask you about how the EPA's enforcement discretion is treated in that regard, because I think it goes to this point about past sales. Let's say if someone was selling in 2000, you know, what are we, 2021? So 2016, 17, 18, whether or not they stop sales, what if they then get testing and the testing on those parts show no adverse effect? So I guess the hypothetical is would EPA pursue them for those years if they came after the testing occurred? So now the EPA visits in 19 and the testing occurred in 18, but the sales were still 16, 17, and just slightly varying the facts, as you were talking about earlier. If you show up, they don't have testing, you're halfway down the road and the manufacturer gets testing that shows no adverse impact. How's the EPA going to treat those?
Well, while it would be case by case, I think it's fair to say, generally, that we would, very much consider emissions testing of the product at any time it's provided to us. We want more information, but as a process matter, if we come asking and there's just no data to show no adverse effect on emissions, the product appears to be problematic on what information we can gather, then we may commit ourselves to an enforcement action before that testing is done. It takes time to do that, but I can foresee a situation where future test data would show no adverse effect on emissions, and that would cause us to seek a lower penalty or forego those claims entirely. It's possible, and it's within our discretion to do that.
Dave, can I just add a perspective? We have had cases where, and part of Evan's problem is this has gone from a program where a couple people in DC to all 10 EPA offices across the country. We have definitely had cases where a tuner, for example, did not have an EO at the time of distribution or sale, but it subsequently goes through testing, gets an EO, and the case team has been insistent that we pay a penalty, or the company pay a penalty, even though it turns out no harm, no foul. So I think it's just something to work through. And I understand what Evan's trying to do in terms of people using deletes on road, but that type of circumstance, I think, is certainly concerning, and it's difficult to explain to companies.
And thank you, Justin. And to that point, this is not pile on Evan, but because I know to Justin's point, the program has grown exponentially. But the reason why we're here, and we hope industry's taking away from this, that maybe there is some room for improvement, because the other example that we have heard is in enforcement, folks in the recent past saying the only way you can illustrate or display reasonable basis is with a CARB EO. And I know that's not the case. I know that's not what the policy says. I know that's not what you have said on this, and I believe that to be true. But these are important points that the EPA needs to continue to improve and develop consistency on, because our industry is going to rely on these things, these statements.
So another question category that is coming up here is OBD. There's a lot of perhaps confusion or questions surrounding OBD. And Evan, I think I'm going to make a little bit of a statement here, and I want to see if you tend to agree with this. But the OBD system is viewed by EPA as call it an onboard emissions station. In other words, the OBD system is intended to monitor and report, the emissions functionality of the vehicle. And because of that, EPA puts a lot of emphasis on the functionality of the OBD system. And I think some of the questions that are popping up are probably related to, what can and can't be done within the OBD system and still be compliant. And I think the language is in the tampering policy might be difficult to understand on that. And so maybe you could elaborate a little bit on what the EPA's stance is related to OBD, and what changes can be made. And I will just kind of preface this by saying that I think you've already made it clear that if you make changes that are acceptable to CARB, such that a product can receive a CARB EO, then those types of changes are considered acceptable by EPA as well.
It's an important subject. I appreciate the questions. And I'm going to answer it, and it's not likely to satisfy a lot of listeners out there, but here it goes. To the last part there, Peter, what I've said and what the policy says is that if your product is covered by a CARB executive order, that's a reasonable basis. Even if CARB allowed, tolerated some changes to OBD. But just because CARB tolerated those changes to OBD in the context of its review and approval of that part does not mean that EPA thinks it's fine. EPA is, I'm not here to provide any comfort on OBD, guys. It's too important to maintain emissions controls. It's too important to support states in their efforts to check vehicles in some of the most polluted parts of our country where people have bad air quality. And it's, and it's a highly complicated and technical matter. And so we in the tampering policy say a lot about exercising discretion, how under certain circumstances we're not going to move forward with enforcement, but we're not providing any of those commitments when it comes to OBD. And we aren't here in the policy or in this webinar or anywhere else articulating what changes to OBD are and are not legal. The Act says you cannot bypass, defeat, or modify an element of design, and OBD is one of those elements of design.
All right. I think we have hit on a lot of the major topics here. I realize that there are a lot of individual questions or with some individual nuance to them. I'm going to, in the last few minutes here, I'm going to put my own email into the chat. Dave and Justin, if you want to put yours in as well, that way we can be available for answering questions that if you have specific questions that didn't get answered or did not get fully answered to your liking, I think we'd be happy to try to tackle those. Evan, I'm gonna.
I have one more question. I was sort of putting this off. So I understand where this is going to go, Evan, but we've gotten several inquiries, and I think it's worth the discussion that you, Justin, and I are about to have. Folks have asked about how this policy in the Clean Air Act applies to foreign sales and the issue, and anticipating sort of the EPA position that it's manufacturing that is illegal. I would say in reading the Clean Air Act, it's manufacturing devices that circumvent EPA emission standards, i.e. that puts a jurisdictional qualification where EPA emission standards apply. So if I'm manufacturing here in the United States with the sole purpose, intent, and I can show it because it's the point of evidence, I can ship this, or I can show you I've shipped this to whatever foreign jurisdiction. What's the EPA's position on that?
Right. Our position is right there in the Clean Air Act. You can't manufacture defeat devices. Right. So we've got a prohibition on manufacturing that makes no reference to export. In contrast to, the very same section, 203 of the Clean Air Act talks about new vehicles and engines, but expressly provides for export and explains how that's an exception to the legal prohibitions and how to do it. A few years ago, it's a little off topic, but we were asked about, well, what about tampering a truck that you're preparing to export to a foreign market? So-called downgrading. And in writing, we wrote back and said, yeah, that's tampering with no exception.
Yeah, Dave, I'm going to share a point of view. We do a lot of these cases. We've done them for years. EPA, very, very talented lawyers who work for Evan, very aggressive lawyers, have taken the opposite view. And what I think the concern is, not to speak for Evan, but you get somebody in the Detroit area who does something to a truck and says, oh, it's going to Windsor, but it's really driving around the US roads. At least to me, I agree with Evan, there is a tampering prohibition, there's a manufacturing prohibition, but it's for a motor vehicle. And if you look at the definition, that's something to be for here. It's not something you're sending to Tanzania or Mexico. And there's a general principle in the law called the presumption against extraterritoriality, meaning that unless Congress is very, very clear that a law applies extraterritorially, meaning to sales overseas, it only applies in the US. And there are provisions of the Clean Air Act, like Section 115, that apply to international air pollution. There's nothing like that in Title II of the Clean Air Act governing vehicle emissions. So yes, I understand why Evan's saying that. Yes, I understand why it's come up in cases, because they have had people say we're selling overseas and it's driving around in Detroit. But do I think that that's a significant risk? No. If you are truly selling to Mexico and it's not coming in here, EPA is free to do whatever it wants, just like anyone can file a complaint. But do I think that is a sustainable position if it's purely foreign? No. I mean, I respectfully disagree with the position Evans articulated, and the position I'm taking is something that we've been told by other EPA people. We've had clients who complained about foreign competitors doing things in other markets. So, I mean, to me, it's an interesting legal question, but I think for the most part, and this has been true with our clients, it's been on the margins. We have not seen a case where that is really the driver of potential risks.
Dave, do you see any other questions you specifically want to address before we're done here? I have one that I'll close with, but it's kind of lofty.
Sorry, we are at time, so why don't you throw out the lofty question, and then we'll stop after that. But again, I think we will circulate email addresses for Justin, Peter, and myself. I don't want anyone bombarding Evan, although you can find him on the web. Sorry, Evan. But anyway, no, all kidding aside, and then any specific questions or scenarios, shoot them to us and we'll help you out. But go ahead, Peter.
All right, so this is the lofty question. Evan, other industries are allowed to purchase carbon credits to offset pollution output. Why is the auto aftermarket not given such an option?
A good question. Yeah, there's pollution trading regimes in a lot of different areas, in air and other media too. I mean, the simplest answer is that there's not a law, statute, or regulation that sets that up. It's not to say that it couldn't be possible, but the law would need to be changed.
Very interesting. Well, that's I think we'll end on that note. Evan, I want to thank you for your time with us today. Myself, Dave, and Justin, we are available to answer questions. So please feel free to reach out to us as needed. Dave, you want to?
Yeah, listen, again, I thank everyone for participating. I hope the folks that sat through all of this got something out of it. Bottom line, this is a very new policy. It is something that will evolve. I'm sure of that, through additional interpretation and understanding, what private industry, the SEMA garage, will do to show that in fact we are equally good to a CARB EO, as well as if it comes to it, court rulings, what have you. But please understand that SEMA is here to protect our industry and to advocate for you. And then at the same time, and I have to be fair, the EPA has their job, and it is ensuring clean air in the environment, and I respect that. So we're going to continue to work with the EPA and be a good partner. And again, I say thank you very much, Evan, for being on this.
It was my pleasure. Thank you for your questions and for all your work to get this right. I think it's going to make a big difference for people's health.